Robert had been working as a security guard for almost 5 years, and the overnight shift at the warehouse was usually uneventful. He spent most of his time doing routine patrols, checking the locks, and keeping an eye on the security monitor. On quiet nights, the most excitement he encountered was the occasional stray cat sneaking into the parking lot. But this particular night was different. The rain poured relentlessly, creating a rhythmic drumming on the metal roof that seemed to amplify every small sound within the vast, empty warehouse. Robert liked the solitude, but tonight the building felt unusually eerie, as though the shadows were darker, the silence heavier. Around 1 a.m., as he was finishing his second patrol, the back door alarm went off. The shrill beeping broke the quiet, making Robert jump. He frowned, pulling out his flashlight and heading toward the rear of the building. It wasn't uncommon for the alarm to be triggered by strong winds or a misaligned sensor. Still, Robert followed protocol, radioing the alarm to his supervisor and carefully unlocking the back door. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and when he shone his flashlight outside, the beam barely penetrated the darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing faintly in the storm. No one answered. Robert stepped out into the rain, his flashlight sweeping over the empty parking lot and the chain-link fence surrounding the property. The gate was locked, and there were no signs of anyone nearby. Satisfied that it was likely a false alarm, Robert reset the system and returned inside. But the feeling of unease lingered. Back in the control room, Robert reviewed the footage from the security cameras. Most of the screens showed static images of the warehouse interior, rows of shelves stacked with boxes and pallets. He fast-forwarded through the footage but saw nothing unusual. Then, on the camera pointed at the back door, something caught his attention. A figure, a tall, shadowy shape, appeared briefly at the edge of the frame. It lingered for a moment before vanishing into the darkness. Robert's stomach churned. Whoever it was had been there. Determined to stay vigilant, Robert decided to patrol the warehouse again. This time, he moved slower, his flashlight cutting through the dimly lit aisles as he checked every corner and crevice. About halfway through his patrol, he heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the far end of the storage area. His breath caught as he turned toward the noise, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. The rustling stopped. Robert moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. As he rounded the corner of a shelving unit, his flashlight illuminated a stack of boxes that had been knocked over. His first thought was that it could have been caused by an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat that had somehow gotten inside. But then he saw it, a wet footprint on the concrete floor. It wasn't the paw print of an animal. It was human. Robert's pulse quickened as he followed the trail of footprints, which led deeper into the warehouse. They were irregular, as if the person had been limping or dragging one foot. The footprints stopped near a stack of pallets. Robert's flashlight swept over the area, revealing nothing but boxes and shadows. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him, a faint shuffle, like someone trying to move quietly. He spun around, but the beam of his flashlight caught only empty space. "Whoever's here, you need to leave," Robert said, his voice firmer now. "The police are on their way." Moments later, he heard the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving above him. His flashlight shot upward, illuminating the steel rafters of the warehouse ceiling. For a split second, he thought he saw a figure crouched in the shadows, but it disappeared before he could get a good look. Robert backed away slowly, his heart pounding. He retreated to the control room and locked the door, calling the police and reporting an intruder. When the officers arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the warehouse. At first, they found nothing, but as they moved toward the back storage area, one of the officers radioed in that they'd found something, or rather, someone. A man was hiding behind a stack of boxes, his clothes soaked from the rain. He was disheveled, with wild eyes and an unsettling grin. The police arrested him on the spot, but when questioned, the man refused to say how he'd gotten in or why he was there. Robert later learned that the man had been carrying a small knife and a length of rope. The thought of what might have happened if he hadn't called the police sent chills down his spine. Although the man was taken away, Robert couldn't shake the memory of that night. Every time he worked the night shift, he found himself glancing over his shoulder, listening for faint sounds, and double-checking the locks, because once you've been hunted in the dark, you never feel safe alone again. For Officer Daniels, patrolling the old, abandoned hospital was usually uneventful. The building had been closed for nearly a decade, a victim of budget cuts and declining use, but its eerie, Decaying halls continued to attract thrill-seekers and vandals. Locals whispered rumors about the place, strange sounds, unexplained cold spots, and the occasional flickering light in a building with no power. Daniels wasn't one to entertain ghost stories. To him, the job was straightforward: keep trespassers out and ensure the building remained untouched. But one night, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. The call came in just after 11 p.m. A security guard at a nearby business reported seeing flashlights moving inside the hospital. Daniels arrived within minutes, the old building looming against the cloudy night sky. The air was heavy with moisture, the scent of rain and mildew mingling with something faintly metallic. Daniels approached cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The main entrance was boarded up, as were most of the windows, but a side door had been forced open. He radioed in his location and stepped inside. The hospital's interior was a shell of its former self. Peeling paint hung in long strips from the walls, and broken tiles crunched underfoot. The air was stifling, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing through the halls. As Daniels moved deeper into the building, he found evidence of recent activity: cigarette butts, empty beer cans, and 2 flashlights abandoned on the floor. He called out, "This is the police. If anyone's here, make yourselves known." His voice echoed through the corridors, but there was no response. Daniels picked up one of the flashlights, noting that it still worked. He switched it on and off, wondering why someone would leave behind a perfectly good flashlight. That's when he heard it, a faint, high-pitched laugh. The sound sent a chill down his spine. It didn't sound natural, more like a child's laughter distorted by static. He turned quickly, his flashlight scanning the hallway behind him, but there was no one there. Daniels continued his search, the laughter echoing intermittently. It seemed to come from different directions, as if something, or someone, was moving through the building. He followed the sound to a stairwell leading to the basement. The air grew colder as he descended, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a small room littered with graffiti and trash. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. Daniels swept the room with his flashlight and noticed a door partially ajar. He pushed it open, revealing a storage area filled with old hospital equipment, wheelchairs, gurneys, and shelves of dusty medical supplies. Something moved in the shadows, and Daniel's flashlight landed on a figure crouched in the corner. "Police! Show me your hands," he shouted, drawing his weapon. The figure didn't move. Daniels approached cautiously, his flashlight trained on the person. It was a mannequin. Relief washed over him, followed immediately by confusion. Why was there a mannequin in the basement of an abandoned hospital? Before he could process this, his radio crackled to life. "Officer Daniels, we've got a report of missing persons near your location. 2 teenagers. Daniels felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The flashlights and cigarettes, they had to belong to the teenager. He radioed back, requesting backup, and continued his search. As he moved through the basement, Daniels noticed more oddities: fresh footprints in the dust, discarded items like a backpack and a phone, and faint smudges on the walls that looked like handprints. Suddenly, he heard a loud crash from somewhere above him. He bolted up the stairs, his flashlight bouncing wildly. The noise led him to a large, empty operating room. A single overhead light flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow. In the center of the room was a chair, and on the chair was a photograph. 2 teenagers, smiling at the camera. Daniel's blood ran cold. The photo was damp, the edges curling as if it had been left in the rain. He searched the room but found no other clues. Backup arrived shortly after, and together, the officers combed the hospital. But there was no sign of the teenagers. They had vanished, leaving behind only the eerie laughter and the photo as evidence of their presence. Over the following weeks, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that he'd missed something crucial. The hospital was boarded up again, but the image of that photo and the sound of that distorted laughter haunted his thoughts. It was a bitterly cold night in mid-December when Kyle, a gas station attendant, noticed the car. The parking lot was usually empty during his late shifts, especially in weather like this, when most people stayed home. The car was parked near one of the pumps, its engine off and windows frosted over. It had been there for at least an hour, which was strange enough. People usually filled up and left within minutes, especially on nights like this. Kyle stepped outside to take a closer look. His breath formed clouds in the icy air, and the snow crunched beneath his boots. The car was a dark sedan, an older model, with no lights on and no visible occupants. "Hello?" Kyle called, knocking lightly on the window. No response. As he moved around to the driver's side, Kyle noticed something odd. The car door was slightly ajar. A chill, not from the weather, ran down his spine. Peering inside, he saw an empty interior. The keys were still in the ignition, and a half-empty coffee cup sat in the cup holder, steam no longer rising from it. On the passenger seat lay a wallet and a cell phone, both untouched. Kyle frowned. Who would leave their belongings in an unlocked car in the middle of the night? He debated calling the police, but decided to wait a little longer. Maybe the driver had gone inside to use the restroom or stepped away for some other reason. But when he checked the store's security footage, no one had come in or out in over 2 hours. Unease began to creep in as Kyle returned to the car. Snow had started to fall again, covering the roof in a thin layer. He noticed fresh footprints leading away from the vehicle, heading toward the back of the gas station where the dumpsters were. Grabbing a flashlight, Kyle followed the tracks. The beam of light danced across the snow-covered ground, revealing the faint outline of the footprints. They were deep, suggesting the person had been walking quickly, maybe even running. The tracks led to the edge of the property and stopped abruptly near a patch of dense trees. Kyle shone his flashlight into the woods, but the darkness swallowed the light. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he called again, his voice shaky. The only answer was the whistle of the wind through the trees. Kyle returned to the car, his unease growing. He decided to call the police, explaining the situation and his concerns. The dispatcher assured him someone would be sent to check it out. While waiting, Kyle couldn't help but examine the car again. He opened the wallet, finding a driver's license belonging to a man named Richard. The address listed was from a town over 50 miles away. What was someone from so far out doing here, on a night like this? The police arrived about 30 minutes later. Officer Ramirez and his partner took over the investigation, searching the car and the surrounding area. They, too, followed the footprints to the tree line, but without proper gear to search the woods, they decided to focus on the vehicle. Inside the car, they found nothing unusual, no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to suggest foul play. The officers ran the license plate and the VIN but were met with something unexpected. The car wasn't registered. In fact, it didn't exist in any database. How is that possible? Kyle asked when Ramirez explained this. The officer shrugged, clearly as baffled as Kyle. Could be a fake plate, but even the VIN isn't coming up. It's like the car doesn't exist. Hours passed, and the investigation turned up no further clues. Eventually, the police had the car towed, promising to follow up with Kyle if they discovered anything. But days turned into weeks, and Kyle never heard back. He tried to find news about the car or the driver online, but there were no updates, no missing person reports, no news stories, nothing. It was as if the car and its owner had vanished into thin air. Months later, Kyle was working another late shift when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. A car pulled into the gas station, a dark sedan, just like the one from that snowy night. It parked at the same pump, its windows frosted over. Kyle's stomach twisted as he stepped outside, his breath visible in the frigid air. He approached the car cautiously, but before he could knock on the window, the engine roared to life, and the car sped off into the night. Kyle stood there, watching as its taillights disappeared down the empty road. He never saw the car, or its driver, again. Even now, Kyle can't explain what happened that night. Was it some sort of prank? A crime gone wrong? Or something far stranger? The mystery of the abandoned car remains unsolved, and every winter, when the snow starts to fall, Kyle finds himself glancing out into the parking lot, half expecting to see that dark sedan waiting for him again. Being a teenage pizza delivery driver was never something Alex considered dangerous. Sure, there were late nights and odd customers, but for the most part, it was an easy job that paid decently and came with free pizza. One night, however, changed Alex's perspective on the job forever. It was a cold autumn evening, and the streets were quieter than usual. Alex was handed an order for a delivery to a park on the outskirts of town. It struck him as odd. Most people gave their home addresses or met him at well-lit locations. Delivering to a park after dark felt strange, but he shrugged it off, thinking it was just someone looking to enjoy the outdoors. He packed up the pizza, punched the address into his GPS, and set off. When Alex arrived, the park was nearly deserted. The soft glow of a single street lamp illuminated a narrow path that led into the woods, and the parking lot was empty except for a single car parked near the tree line. He hesitated, staring at the order details on his phone. The delivery instructions were simple: meet at the bench near the walking trail entrance. With a nervous sigh, Alex grabbed the pizza and started walking. The crunch of leaves under his feet was the only sound, and the dense trees on either side of the trail seemed to close in around him. He spotted the bench up ahead, dimly lit by the street lamp. Sitting on the bench was a man in a hooded jacket, his face obscured by the shadows. "Pizza delivery," Alex called out, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood up slowly, almost deliberately, and began walking toward Alex. Did you order the pizza?" Alex asked, clutching the box tightly. The man nodded, but something about his movements felt off. His posture was stiff, his steps too calculated. As he approached, Alex noticed the man wasn't holding anything. No wallet, no phone. Just empty hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Do you have the money?" Alex asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly, as if studying Alex. Then, in a low, almost whispery voice, he said, "Follow me." Every instinct in Alex's body screamed at him to run, but the man had already started walking toward the woods. Alex hesitated, glancing back at his car parked in the lot. This wasn't normal, but he also didn't want to risk losing the tip, or worse, getting a bad review. "Where are we going?" Alex asked, following cautiously. "The bonfire," the man replied without turning around. "Bonfire?" Alex scanned the area but saw no signs of firelight. The only light came from the dim street lamp near the bench. As they moved deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the sounds of the outside world faded away. Alex clutched the pizza box like a shield, his nerves on edge. They reached a small clearing, and that's when Alex saw it. A faint glow in the distance, just beyond the trees. "There," the man said, pointing toward the light. Alex squinted, trying to make out what he was seeing. The glow came from a small fire, surrounded by several shadowy figures. The group appeared to be standing in a circle, their faces obscured by the flickering light. "Is this your group?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stopped walking and turned to face Alex. For the first time, Alex could see his face, or rather, the lack of it. The man was wearing a plain white mask, the kind you'd find at a costume store. Before Alex could react, another figure emerged from the shadows. This one was wearing a similar mask but carried something in his hand, a long, thin object that glinted in the firelight. Panic surged through Alex as he realized it was a knife. Without thinking, Alex dropped the pizza and turned to run. The figures behind him shouted, their voices distorted and guttural, but he didn't look back. He sprinted through the trees, his feet slipping on the damp leaves, until he burst out of the woods and into the parking lot. His car was the only one there. Fumbling with his keys, Alex unlocked the door and threw himself inside, locking it behind him. He glanced back toward the trail and saw the masked man standing at the edge of the trees, his knife glinting in the street lamp's glow. Alex didn't wait. He started the car and sped out of the lot, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. When he got back to the pizza shop, Alex told his manager what had happened. The police were called, and Alex filed a report, but by the time officers arrived at the park, the fire was out, and the clearing was empty. The only evidence left behind was the abandoned pizza box, now trampled into the dirt. To this day, Alex doesn't know what the group wanted or why they had lured him there. All he knows is that he narrowly escaped something far worse than losing a tip. It was supposed to be a quick trip, a scenic drive through the backroads to clear my head. I'd done it dozens of times before, enjoying the solitude and the peace of being surrounded by trees, far from the noise of the city. But this time, the tranquility of the forest turned into something far more sinister. The road was narrow and winding, flanked on both sides by dense woods. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across the pavement. I had just passed the last small town on my route when my car began to sputter. I glanced at the dashboard and saw the fuel gauge needle dropping faster than it should have. Before I could process what was happening, the car gave one last shudder and coasted to a stop. I was stranded. I pulled out my phone, but of course, there was no signal. Typical for this area. The only option was to wait and hope that another car came by, though the road was so rarely traveled that it felt like wishful thinking. I rolled down the window, letting in the cool evening air. The forest was alive with the sound of chirping crickets and rustling leaves. At first, the sounds were comforting, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. But as the minutes stretched into hours, the noises began to take on a more ominous tone. It started with the snapping of twigs, faint but deliberate, as if someone, or something, was moving through the underbrush. At first, I told myself it was just an animal. Deer were common in this area, and it wasn't unusual to hear them wandering nearby. But then the sounds grew closer, and the snapping twigs were joined by something heavier, the crunch of boots on leaves. My pulse quickened as I scanned the woods, but I couldn't see anything through the thick shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest was plunged into darkness. I locked the car doors and turned on the interior light, hoping it would make me feel safer. Instead, it only made me more aware of how vulnerable I was. The noises outside grew louder, closer. The crunching leaves circled the car, stopping every few seconds before resuming again. It was as if someone was pacing, watching me from just beyond the tree line. My hands shook as I clutched my phone, desperately trying to find a signal. Still nothing. Hours passed, and the noises eventually stopped. I began to convince myself that it had all been in my head, a trick of my imagination fueled by fear and isolation. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I saw it. A shadow moved between the trees, tall and unmistakably human. It wasn't the quick, darting motion of an animal. It was deliberate, calculated. The figure stopped at the edge of the woods, standing perfectly still as it stared at my car. My heart pounded as I reached for the only weapon I had, a tire iron from the trunk. For what felt like an eternity, the figure didn't move. Then, without warning, it took a step forward, and I caught a glimpse of something glinting in its hand. A knife? A gun? I couldn't tell, but it was enough to send me into full panic mode. I started the car, praying that whatever was wrong with the engine had miraculously fixed itself. But the ignition clicked uselessly, refusing to turn over. The figure took another step closer. I honked the horn, hoping the noise would scare it off, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it crouched low, as if preparing to sprint toward me. Just as I thought I was done for, headlights appeared in the distance. Another car was coming down the road. The figure froze, then bolted back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Relief washed over me as the car pulled up behind mine. It was my friend Jake, who I had texted earlier before I lost service. Jake stepped out, flashlight in hand. "You okay?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. I nodded, still trembling. "There was someone out there," I said, pointing toward the woods. Jake frowned, scanning the area with his flashlight. After a few moments, he shook his head. "I don't see anyone." We worked quickly to get my car running, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As Jake tightened the cables to jumpstart my engine, I glanced toward the woods and saw them, eyes, reflecting the light from his flashlight. The drive back to town was silent. Jake could tell I was shaken, and I didn't want to scare him by mentioning the eyes. The next day, I told Jake everything. He listened carefully before revealing something that sent a chill down my spine. "When I was driving to get you," he said, "I passed a guy standing on the side of the road, maybe a mile from where you broke down. He was holding something. I think it was a rifle. To this day, I don't know who, or what, I encountered in the woods that night, but I haven't taken a drive on that road since, and I never will again."